Robert De Niro was on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, sitting beneath the familiar studio lights, his expression unreadable but his presence commanding as always. The kind of quiet authority that years of work and instinct bestow on someone who's seen too much and talked too little. It had started off like any other segment. Jon welcomed him with warmth. The crowd applauded. A few jokes flew across the desk. De Niro gave his trademark half smile, and they launched into a discussion about aging in Hollywood, the state of modern cinema, politics, and a recent film De Niro was promoting. The rhythm felt natural, smooth even, but there was a slight tension in the air, one of those unspoken things that seasoned performers recognize but don't address unless it becomes impossible not to. Midway through a question about the intersection of art and activism, Jon suddenly looked past De Niro toward the audience and with a quick apologetic glance said, "Hey, give me just 5 seconds. I need to ask the crowd something real quick. Hold that thought." He was already rising from his chair, gesturing to a producer off camera. De Niro didn't move. His jaw tightened slightly, eyes following Stewart as he stepped forward, laughing lightly as he cupped his hand near his mouth and leaned into the front row. The camera tried to stay on Jon, but De Niro's stillness was magnetic, unyielding, the kind of stillness that demanded attention more than any noise could. Something subtle shifted then. De Niro blinked once, slowly, and then muttered under his breath, barely audible, but captured by the hot mic. "End this shit." The sound engineer flinched in the control room. For a moment, no one in the studio reacted. Jon turned back with a half smile, not yet realizing what had been said. De Niro sat there, now staring at Jon, not like a guest waiting his turn, but like a man deciding whether he'd had enough. The mood in the room started to bend, somewhere between confusion and a collective tightening in the chest. The audience sensed it too. You could feel the recalibration happening in real time. The way Jon paused at the edge of the desk, reading De Niro's face, uncertain if this was a bit or something deeper. "Hey," Jon said lightly, maybe trying to keep the tone friendly, maybe trying to buy a second to understand what had just happened. The cameras kept rolling. Producers stood still behind the curtain. The crowd didn't laugh. No one knew if they should. Something was shifting, and no one could tell which direction it would go yet, and that's where it all really began. "I'm not going anywhere," Robert De Niro said, his voice low but carrying clearly across the stunned studio, each word measured like he'd rehearsed it for years, though everyone in the room could tell this wasn't rehearsed at all. This was the kind of truth that doesn't get polished before it's said. "I came here to be on the show, to sit here and talk, not to get up and move around like a damn extra. If I go, you might as well end this shit." The words hit heavier than anyone expected, and for a second, even the lights felt like they dimmed, though nothing had changed except the atmosphere. Jon Stewart froze halfway into his return to the desk, clearly thrown off, his body still angled as if he wasn't sure whether to sit or walk away. You could practically see the producer's face pale behind the curtain. The audience was locked in that unique silence between tension and secondhand embarrassment, unsure if they were witnessing a breakdown, a confrontation, or something else entirely. De Niro wasn't yelling. He wasn't even animated. He was calm, maybe too calm, and that's what made it worse. He wasn't trying to stir drama. He wasn't performing. Jon blinked, visibly unsettled, and made a half step forward like someone approaching a wild animal, arms slightly raised, palms open. "Robert," he said quietly, trying to pull the moment back toward some kind of sanity, I didn't mean to offend you. I was just asking the audience a quick question. It's something we do sometimes for a sketch." De Niro cut him off, not with volume, but with weight. "You don't tell me what to do. You're not my director. You're not my boss. You invited me here. I showed up. I'm here. And now you want to ask me to step aside like I'm in the way? That's not how this works. Not with me." There was a pause that went on a beat too long, and in that silence the room shifted again. Not backward, not forward, just deeper, into something uncharted. Jon stood still, awkwardly balancing between de-escalation and instinct. His face was hard to read, part confusion, part disbelief, and something else too, maybe fear, but not the kind born from danger. It was the fear that comes when you realize someone you thought you understood might not play by the same rules you do, or worse, that you never really understood them at all. "I've always respected you," Jon finally said softly, but the sentence didn't land. It hung there, untouched. De Niro didn't respond. He just stared, the way a man stares when he's already moved on from the conversation but hasn't left yet. People think tension comes from shouting, but this wasn't that kind of tension. This was cold, clinical, methodical, and it wasn't going away. Somewhere in the back, the cue cards were being shuffled nervously, probably rewritten, probably irrelevant now. A floor manager made a motion to cut to commercial, but Jon waved it off, still standing, still unsure. It was the first time in a long time he looked small on his own stage. "Why now?" Jon asked finally, barely above a whisper, but the mic caught it. "Why say that now?" De Niro turned slowly, meeting his eyes, and for a moment it felt like he might not answer at all. But then he spoke, his voice almost softer than before. "You get to joke about everything. You get to sit behind the desk, make your points, play the smart guy. But sometimes you don't know when you're being disrespectful. Not because you're mean, just because you forgot how to shut the hell up." Another silence. No one in the room moved. A cough from somewhere in the back row was the only sound. Jon blinked. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He looked like a man genuinely trying to process something he didn't have the tools to process. Maybe he thought inviting De Niro would be a classic episode. Legacy actor, relevant message, few laughs, deep nods, clip goes viral. Instead, he got this. An unfiltered confrontation with the kind of man who doesn't play by the late-night rules, who doesn't smile for optics or bend to improv beats. Jon stepped back slightly, finally sitting, though it didn't feel like he had taken control of anything. If anything, it looked like he sat to avoid falling over. De Niro didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He just sat still, arms on the chair, watching. The camera panned between them, unsure where the focus should land, as if it too was waiting for instructions that would never come. "You know," Jon said suddenly, almost laughing but not quite, "I didn't expect today to be the day this show changed." He looked toward the audience, then back at De Niro. "But maybe this was overdue." That's when something strange happened. Not dramatic, not loud, just strange in its subtlety. De Niro's posture relaxed, just barely. Not enough to call it forgiveness or even acceptance, but enough to suggest he heard what Jon said and didn't hate it. A twitch at the corner of his mouth, not a smile, but something close to it, passed like a flicker. The audience didn't know what to do. Clap? Breathe? Wait? Even the crew was paralyzed, unsure if this was the end of the segment or the beginning of something entirely new. And the camera, still rolling, caught all of it. The tension, the pause, the flicker, and the heavy, unresolved space between two men who came to talk and ended up colliding. That's when the screen dipped into silence, holding just long enough to make you think it was over. But it wasn't. Not yet. Not like that. Because moments later, the producer whispered something to Jon, and his eyes widened slightly, just slightly, enough for only the camera to catch. And De Niro, seeing the change, leaned in just a bit, eyes sharp again. He knew something had shifted. The audience didn't yet, but they would, because what was coming next wasn't what anyone thought. Jon finally stood again, this time with less hesitation, and said quietly but audibly enough for the mic to catch it, "Come on, let's step aside for a minute. I'll explain everything." His voice wasn't defensive anymore, and there was no trace of sarcasm left. It was just human, disarmed, asking for a chance to clarify, to bring things back from the edge. De Niro looked at him for a moment, unreadable as ever, then gave a short nod, slow and heavy, as if weighing more than just the gesture. The two of them walked off set, slipping past the curtain with a stagehand leading the way to one of the side dressing rooms, leaving the studio in a stunned quiet where the lights kept shining, but the tension hung like smoke. The audience murmured quietly among themselves, but no one left. No one checked their phone. No one even looked away from the stage. They were hooked, Not because of scandal, but because something rare had just unfolded. Something unpolished, unscripted, real. In the room backstage, away from cameras and expectations, Jon and Robert sat in two mismatched chairs, both still caught in the remains of whatever had just cracked open between them. Jon spoke first, calmly, earnestly explaining that the moment he stepped away had nothing to do with disrespect or control. He told Robert about the sketch planned for the second half of the segment, something lighthearted that involved the crowd and would have tied into a punchline for his new movie. Nothing serious, nothing personal. Robert listened in silence, watching him closely, then nodded once, slowly, before sighing and letting his shoulders drop just slightly. He said he'd been carrying something with him lately, something heavy, and it didn't take much to trigger it. Something in the way Jon had asked him to step aside had felt like a dismissal, not an invitation, and it landed harder than it should have. He admitted he'd misread it, maybe because he came in carrying too much of the outside world on his back, and for that, he said, he was sorry. Jon leaned forward, hands clasped together, and said he was sorry too. Not just for the misunderstanding, but for not realizing sooner that something was off. He said it was a reminder that even the most seasoned people, the legends, still feel things deeply, still need space to be heard without it becoming a spectacle. They sat in that shared quiet for another minute, not needing to say much more, just letting the weight fall off them in the unspoken way that happens when mutual respect is slowly restored. Then Robert stood, smoothed his jacket, and said, "Let's finish it." And so they walked back out together side by side, to the sound of uncertain applause, the kind that starts as polite but grows into something real when the crowd sees both men return, not as performer and host, but as two human beings who had just taken a detour through something messy and came out the other side intact. Jon sat first, giving Robert the spotlight. De Niro cleared his throat, looked out at the audience, then turned slightly toward Jon and said into the mic, "I want to say something before we continue. I was out of line earlier. I let something small get too big, and that's on me. Jon's been nothing but respectful, and I owe him an apology, so, Jon, I'm sorry." The audience clapped, more than clapped. They reacted with something close to relief, as if the room itself had exhaled. Jon nodded, took a second, then said, "I appreciate that. And I'm sorry too, if anything I did came off wrong. That's on me." The camera zoomed out slightly, capturing both of them in frame, as the moment settled into something warm, even tender. They continued the show, and while the energy was calmer, more subdued, it wasn't awkward. If anything, it felt richer now, grounded by the vulnerability they just let everyone witness. The final minutes were unscripted but honest, and when the credits rolled, the audience stood, not in standing ovation, but in quiet respect, the kind you don't manufacture. And while everything technically ended as planned, final segment, closing thank yous, wave to the camera, something about it lingered longer than usual. It wasn't just another episode. It was the kind of night people would bring up again, not because of drama or scandal, but because of what it revealed. Not about celebrity, not about television, but about how two people under the lights found their way back from a moment that could have broken everything.